Welcome, everyone. Welcome, particular, to our special event here the day after, day following Earth Day, which is our Picard Lecture today. And we are very grateful and thankful for the Reverend Frank Picard, who is here today. So thank you very much. And his generosity has made this lectureship possible. Reverend Picard is an alum of United, also a former trustee, so he was reminiscing a little bit as we were kind of walking through this new space, and is currently interim pastor at St. James United Church of Christ in Barnesville, Minnesota. So thank you again. I'll also just say a quick word of introduction to our speaker today, our lecturer for today, who is Nate Van Yperen. Did I say that right? Close enough, okay. Who has been an adjunct faculty for us in the area of ethics, particularly comparative religious ethics, which has been a very popular class here at United, and Nathaniel has been a popular adjunct professor. So we're very grateful for the work you've done here. He is also visiting assistant professor at Gustavus Adolphus College, teaching courses on religion and ecology, race and religion. He earned his PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary in, I believe, ethics, with an emphasis on environmental ethics, ecological ethics, and interpretations of nature. Nathan has a book coming out this summer called Gratitude for the Wild, Christian Ethics in the Wilderness. And this lecture is also titled Gratitude for the Wild. Very thankful that you're here, and why don't you come up and lecture for us?
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here and to see a number of familiar faces from classes, other contexts. And I just want to, in the spirit of gratitude, also offer some thanks to, first to the donor and the one who made this event possible, Frank Picard. It's delightful to get to know you for a few moments before the lecture. I look forward to future and more conversation, as well as Kyle Roberts on behalf of the seminary here inviting me to this event today. It is great to be here among you. As Kyle mentioned, my book is coming out in June, which is perfect timing for Christmas presents, Thanksgiving presents, Labor Day presents. No, I kid, of course, but I am excited to have it out, and I'm excited to share some of the themes of that book with you today. My lecture is entitled Gratitude for the Wild. I aim to hit 20 minutes on the nose, which will leave us some time for discussion. I'll certainly be open to answer questions related to the lecture, related to the book, or to explore with you new directions, new possibilities that may have sparked in your imagination over the course of this lecture. I wish to speak a word for wilderness. I wish to speak a word for the wild that we can come to know as wilderness, for the places where landscape invigorates the imagination and can measure cultural enterprise. I wish to speak a word for wilderness because its existence matters to the health and character of individuals and communities in a consumer-oriented society. To sojourn in the wilderness and to immerse oneself in the idea of wilderness presents opportunities to practice habits of gratitude. Such practices can illuminate, amplify, and reshape Christian ideas of responsibility and refine the project of theological anthropology toward a fuller, if more mysterious, accounting of creatureliness. The wilderness as a site for the flourishing of the wild reminds us that humankind is a new arrival on this earth, that primeval processes precede cultural history, and that it can be virtuous to leave some things alone. In the wilderness, we might learn to see the God of the Christian tradition not as a person made in our image, but as that wild creator of Job 39. In the mid-19th century, Henry David Thoreau announced his wish to speak a word for nature. Thoreau's attempt to speak a word for nature is an attempt to wake the neighbors up. Thoreau's descriptions of encounters with the natural world serve as a wide-ranging social criticism that indicts a culture enamored with what he calls improved means to unimproved ends. Over the course of the essay Walking, Thoreau saunters from his pronouncement of a desire to speak a word for nature to a concluding and forceful denunciation of fugitive slave laws. Thoreau's gospel, according to this moment, as he called it, links wildness and justice intimately. Thoreau evokes a vision of justice in which the social and the ecological are inseparable. A century on, Wallace Stegner narrowed Thoreau's task to wilderness. He writes, "I want to speak for the wilderness idea as something that has helped form our character and that has certainly shaped our history as a people." Stegner speaks for a generation of activists that eventually secured the legislative achievement of the Wilderness Act of 1964. In the middle part of the 20th century, a grassroots democratic movement spoke for nature and rooted that speech in federal law. Admittedly, I do not possess the powers of a Thoreau or Stegner. But in my book, Gratitude for the Wild, I follow them in the conviction that the nature of our encounters with the wild can reveal who we are, as well as to prompt new possibilities of the sorts of people we might become. Attachments to the wild, at least in my case, can contribute to a general restlessness with regard to disembodied academic debates that privilege theory over encounters. One does not, of course, quote Jacques Lacan in A Tender Note to a Lover, and no one consults a textbook in the work of friendship. Even David Attenborough, in all of his charm, cannot properly or adequately prepare you for the electric experience of encountering a bear in the backcountry. The point I want to make is simple and obvious. Articulating our loves in a way that is consistent with their meaningfulness to our lived experience is difficult. It's hard to find the right words, and theories are often ill-shaped to capture the reasons for our attachments. The words that one does find often do not feel adequate for very long. Yet for many of us who write on the wild, wilderness is not an open question. It's already a commitment born of love. Its vulnerability is our vulnerability. I'm therefore interested in the basic ways that encounters with the wild can interact, confirm, cloud, and animate our notions of what it means to be an embodied person in a world that we can experience as both beautiful and terrible. I'm after an ethic of the wild through wilderness that is responsive, not consumptive, grateful, not sentimental. My exploration of the wilderness is a mode of social criticism, as well as the medium for establishing an adequate foundation for a Christian ethic of the wild. And yet there is a sense in which my project and these interests in wilderness arrive too late. Wilderness is no longer the central focus of the environmental movement. As an idea, and even as a conservation strategy, it has been roundly criticized and deconstructed. Many conservationists have turned away from the wilderness in favor of literal and figurative gardens. But even more than a shift in landscape, climate change, for obvious and important reasons, now directs the attention of most ecologically minded religious ethicists. Yet, in the noble and important confrontation with the wickedness of anthropogenic climate change, our boots can sometimes lift off the ground as we consider the global and atmospheric scope of our shared problems. And like most academic scholarship, climate ethics runs the risk of further dislocating already dislocated scholars. Wilderness brings us back down to earth, to place. Not as an alternative, but as a correlative work that connects us to the specific landscapes through particular loves. And so I'm insisting here today among you that there is a continued significance for wilderness as a place and as an idea in Christian ecological ethics. Specifically, I'm interested in how the experience of what we consecrate as wilderness fits within a theological tradition that has largely prioritized revelation, interpreted through tradition and reason. The wild known in wilderness raises our tolerance for mystery in the recognition of our limits and in the celebration of a God-loved world that exceeds our grasping. Wilderness experiences can evoke visions of a good life in which creaturely limits are accepted in gratitude, even in the face of ambiguity and mystery. I speak my word from wilderness as a convert. I value wilderness because I have experienced it directly. I seek it out. I yearn for it after too many days desk-bound in ivory towers, and I count myself fortunate that my love of wilderness issues from a lifetime of direct experiences in the Adirondacks and New England forests and fishing rivers in the West. In wildernesses, I have experienced fleeting feelings of wholeness, a deep sense of gratitude, not a little misery, and many instances in which gratitude and awe were called out of me. The obvious and apparent danger in such testimony, of course, is that the accidents and contingencies of my own experiences, interpreted either through privilege or taste, or both, might be uncritically repackaged as a prescriptive account of Christian ethics in the wild. There are, to be sure, pitfalls in an evocative mode. I'm of the mind, though, that it's worth the risk. Informed by the witness of thinkers such as Erzim Kohak and James Gustafson, and inspired by a range of nature writers, environmental writers, my project and my interests aim to evoke an appreciation for wilderness that ultimately reorients us to what Martin Luther King Jr. called a revolution of our values. I have been at times, however, bewildered by the challenge of articulating the wilderness as a medium of grace. Of course, Protestant Christianity has often told of the antithesis of revelation and nature. A fallen humanity dragged the world and all its creatures into a state of struggle and confusion. Nature still collectively groans for the day of redemption. What is often missing in such a portrayal are sufficient accounts of the experiences of gratitude that characterize many encounters with the mysterious wild, even those encounters that end in loss. In short, I believe that the Christian theological tradition has not sustained enough of a focus on wildness in relation to piety. A primary aim of my project is to refocus attention on the role of affection and testimony in ecological ethics. It is an attempt to answer a question posed by Robin Wall Kimmerer in her extraordinary book, Braiding Sweetgrass. She writes, "What would it be like to be raised on gratitude, to speak to the natural world as a member of the democracy of species, to raise a pledge of interdependence?" A presumption of my work, therefore, is that articulating, cultivating, and embodying gratitude can be the radical work of Christian ecological ethics. Anxieties about anthropocentrism have led many interpreters away from precisely these themes of attachment as scholars commit their efforts to theories or practical strategies. Yet I'm interested in a mode of Christian ethics that bears witness to affections nurtured through experience of the wilds that we call wilderness. It recognizes a correspondence between the testimonial character of nature writing or environmental writing with the Christian ethical tradition of concerns with character and virtue. It asks the question of what it can mean to give a testimony that is consistent with and measured by the goods and mysteries of the wild. And this broad topic of gratitude for the wild is, of course, too broad. It needs boundary markers. And for this reason, I focus on one example from a spectrum of human experiences of the wild, namely wilderness. The idea of wilderness is one that uniquely occupied the American imagination. As such, it is also an idea that is woven through with the prejudices that have captured the American imagination. Still, wilderness as a site and an idea can measure our continuity and discontinuity with the wild, of what we take to be valuable and what we will work to conserve. This term wilderness calls forth numerous associations that tie together the aspiration of achieving an ideal as well as the corresponding policies of a landscape with legislated boundaries. The appreciation and conservation of wilderness is possible through a sense of gratitude, illuminated by a humility that recognizes the need for reformation and revaluation. Wilderness elicits gratitude in the identification and celebration of the limits of the human person to control the environments in which we dwell, develop, sojourn, and even leave alone. And as such, its conservation offers an alternative education that resists the commodification of the parts of our lives that should not have price tags. Since the passage of the Wilderness Act of 1964, a hotly contested debate over the value of wilderness continues to reveal cultural anxieties about a society that has spurned limits. Wilderness, therefore, is uniquely useful as a medium for social criticism. The idea of wilderness introduces ambiguous questions about the balance between utility and appreciation, of enjoyment and of restraint. In the years following the Wilderness Act, value theorists attempted to account for the intrinsic value of wilderness, independent of the anthropocentric consumerism that characterizes life in the West. Alternatively, pragmatists and virtue theorists tried to explain the significance of wilderness through the identification of shared problems that restrict or inhibit human flourishing on the land. Presently, new conservationists argue that we must shift away from cordoning off wildernesses, preserves, and parks, and instead embrace the resiliency of the natural world as a rambunctious garden. Wilderness, in all of this breadth of influence, is a nexus of competing and contested accounts of responsibility. Our ethical task, I think, is to guard each of these accounts of responsibility from the temptations of sentimentality. The great James Baldwin writes, "Sentimentality, the ostentatious parading of excessive and spurious emotion, is the mark of dishonesty, the inability to feel. The wet eyes of the sentimentalist betray his aversion to experience, his fear of life, his arid heart, and it is always, therefore, the signal of secret and violent inhumanity." End quote. I should say, whenever I quote Baldwin, my temptation is just to keep reading Baldwin. Sentimentality on this account is a form of escape. Baldwin writes elsewhere that the price exacted on the haven dweller is that he contrives to delude himself into believing that he has found a haven. Baldwin's assessment is illuminating when transplanted from his criticisms of the protest novel to the context of the wilderness debate, due to the propensity of nature lovers to sentimentalize the wilderness as a haven. For some, wilderness is a bourgeois playground, a haven for weekend warriors to let off steam built up from the pressures of corporate cubicles. It is often a political cause for white, upper and middle class urbanites who can all too often appear to care more for wild places than the human lives that often struggle on the borders of those legislated boundaries, or on the other sides of the tracks of the cities that they flee. In my home state of New Hampshire, in the White Mountain National Forest, there's a common joke in the backcountry. They don't call them the White Mountains for nothing. Does wilderness conservation then continue a colonial project, effectively erasing indigenous stories, histories, and lifeways? In what ways do race, class, gender, and sexuality factor in terms of education and access to the wild? Or put more pointedly, what could wilderness mean for those voices who have been silenced, excluded, or unacknowledged in the development of the wilderness idea in the United States? Gratitude for the wild cannot and ought not evade these questions. Admittedly, then, there remains a degree of ambiguity woven through any account of gratitude, particularly gratitude for the wilderness. What does it mean to be grateful for the wild today? Does the term gratitude adequately account for the melancholy, for the grief, for even the rage that should arise within us when we consider the conditions of suffering, both natural and social? Does the promise of wilderness operate in spite of these injustices related to race, class, gender, etc.? With regard to natural processes, a mere semblance of gratitude figures the natural world as harmony and cooperation, ignoring, of course, the competition, struggle, and violence of natural selection. A mere semblance of gratitude legitimizes sentimental appeals to the wild. The disposition of gratitude that I'm after here must be much more than mere sentimentality, more than a romanticized view of the natural world. I take all of these questions to be serious and important and insufficient. It is, I want to argue, possible to re-engage the idea of wilderness in a way that on the one hand resists sentimentalism, and the other hand affirms the important role that gratitude can play in appreciating wild places, even against the backdrop of violent histories. Gratitude is a response. Gratitude recognizes and welcomes gifts with hospitality. Yet gratitude need not be narrowly defined to the standard three-term construal of benefice, beneficiary, and benefactor. Gratitude is not the product of gift transaction, as in the case of the anthropocentric idea of God giving nature to humankind. The natural world is much more complicated, and our role in it is at times mysterious. I'm therefore not concerned so much with the dynamics of gift exchange, but with a realistic and a virtuous response to conditions. Gratitude for the wild, properly realized, neither severs the connection of human affection and experience from the wild, nor reduces its significance to human use. Gratitude is an indicator of ecological intelligence, and it's central, therefore, to the work of ecological ethics. Failure to experience and express gratitude is relevant to both ecological and social conversations about justice. Rowan Williams, I think, rightly describes ecological crisis as, quote, part of a general process of losing our feel for what is appropriately human. Gratitude for the wild is, on my account, an appropriately human response. Wilderness is a place and an idea that can instruct us in gratitude, to recover what it means to be appropriately human. There is, finally then, a tragic quality to the sense of gratitude I aim to evoke. The wilderness is not a home. You might be eaten by the very bear you want to protect. The education that awaits us there, though, is not possible, at least fully, within the domesticated boundaries of our households and communities. The call of the wild is a call to encounter mysteries of creaturely life. Yet even when we are grateful, our loves are passing. Sometimes we only realize the depths of gratitude in loss. Gratitude does not seek to escape the inevitability of death, nor the finality of loss, or of the disvalues that abound in the natural world. Instead, it seeks simply to restore depth and significance to a life that is often, too often, reduced to the meaningless but totalizing logic of commodification and our delusions of self-control. Wilderness reorients us to our conditions. The call of the wild can be, I think, a call to prayer. Gratitude welcomes the grace to love beyond oneself, even as we accept the reality of loss as a condition for such love. Our protection of the wild and wilderness is an act of responsibility that testifies to graces known alongside such limits and losses. We can, I think, speak for wilderness in gratitude. Thank you. As advertised, I'd be happy to engage questions or to follow new directions as you might see fit.
And I can travel with the mic. So. Yeah. Professor Wheeler. I'm not going to name everybody.
Nate, brilliant lecture. Cannot wait to read the book. Very excited about your project.
Thank you.
I'm just curious, and I know this isn't necessarily a question you raised, but how has your encounters in the wild and your sort of theologizing around wildness as a category, how has that shaped your understanding of God?
That's a great question. A small question. I will say it's one. there are many places to start here. Let me say one thing that's a little bit lower hanging fruit. I'll tell you a little bit about my book, and then I'll go to the deeper theological question. One thing that this book attempts to do, and you might have picked up in terms of the style here, is it's intentionally transgressing some of the conventions of academic writing. In that I am both in content and substance and style trying to evoke in the reader something akin to my own experiences of gratitude and senses of dependence that I cannot fully articulate. So in one sense, it aims to, as Kohak would say, evoke a feeling more than make an argument, which is risky in academics. But that commitment to do that, it comes out of, as I mentioned, a lifetime of experiences within the wild that both push me farther from where I began as a religious person, but also, I think, closer to a truer and more adequate account of the mysteries of wildness. So one of the questions that animates the whole project is how do you talk about gratitude in the face of violence that we've committed, but also the violence of the natural world that, of course, has to be or is the very conditions by which God could call anything good. And in that way, it pushes me close. One of the figures in the book who pops up regularly is the Jewish philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel. And I'm very fond, and the former students in the room will know that I cite this in every class. One of my favorite quotes of Heschel, it could be the tagline of this book, is trying to pierce the mystery with our categories is like trying to bite a wall. And it's a lovely image, right? Because it acknowledges the limits of finitude and our desire to get a hold of it all. And yet it also acknowledges that the size of the question is always beyond our grasp. And yet we're still bumping up against it, right? So I think in that sense, nature plays a kind of mediating role in the encounter with the wall on Heschel's account. It was a start to the question, but yeah.
Greg, we'll name everybody.
Thanks, that was really good. When you introduced Baldwin,
Yeah.
it was a shock. It was kind of a bang, and I liked it a lot.
Yeah.
Can you speak to how you got to that point where you brought James Baldwin into the thought process?
Yeah.
And maybe that's just a kind of a technical question that's personal, but I really like the way you did that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
I don't associate.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time in the Shawamba-Nicolay National Forest. I don't associate James Baldwin with the boreal forest.
Right.
So.
Right. No, I thank you for this question. I'm very happy to talk at length about Baldwin and how I see connections there. One, I can say just in terms of my own background, Baldwin was an important figure in graduate school. Then I took a graduate seminar that expanded that love and commitment to teaching and talking about his work. But as you note, Baldwin, this is, to my knowledge, nothing about wild spaces. Baldwin, in my work, functions in a similar way to really the hero of this book, which is Martin Luther King Jr., who similarly was never caught out on the trail or camping in the backcountry or talking about wilderness spaces. Yes, but employs that trope of wilderness powerfully to the ends of the civil rights movement. What bringing those voices into conversation does for my project, I hope, is to draw together what I take to be a fundamental principle of environmentalism, which is that the social and the ecological are intimately bound up with one another. And the perils of environmentalism is that it forces a choice between the two. Either you care about poor people or you care about wild places. And the Baldwins and Kings who are talking powerfully and passionately and elegantly about justice lead us to consider how ecological crisis might be the logical consequence of what King called the giant triplets of racism, classism, and militarism. That the very conditions of climate change are the conditions of social injustice that we have created for ourselves and everyone else. So I like to lean on those figures that help us. In the fourth chapter of this book is where I focus a lot on King. It's where Baldwin shows up again. The section begins with a meditation on how do we read this year 1964, in which you have the Civil Rights Act passed and the Wilderness Act. Neither of them speak to the shared concerns that led to their becoming bills. How do we feel, as Laurette Savoy talks about in in her book Trace. How do we fill the space between the social and the ecological? Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Other questions?
Are you a part of the Poor People's Campaign? The work of Martin Luther King Jr., those
Yes.
3 tenets, they added climate justice as well? Yeah.
Yes, no, I am a huge supporter of that movement, and I mentioned someone previously. I'm teaching at Gustavus. One of the privileges of teaching there is I regularly get to teach my King course, and the sort of the guiding vision of that is the triplets now extended to climate justice. So thank you for that. And if you don't know about the Poor People's Campaign, revived now from the way it was sort of stultified in the late 60s, it's worth your attention. Yeah, thank you.
I'm curious about biblical themes of wilderness, and whether they, Exodus with wandering, Jesus tempted in the wilderness. There's these really interesting. Did you make a lot of those connections in your book?
Yes. Well, yes and no. I am, as a Christian ethicist, I respect, and I'm partnered with a biblical scholar, so I know my limitations when it comes to the Bible. But I am interested in the ways in which the American wilderness tradition in particular sort of lifts off of the biblical tradition of wilderness. And there's a turn in the 19th century where it goes from the howling wilderness that's closer to the biblical account of a place of trials and temptations and maybe a few theophanic revelations to now being a romanticized aesthetic sublime, right? And what I'm interested in as a Christian ethicist is how do you work on that boundary, right? I want to think about wilderness as being more than simply a site of trials and risk. But I also don't want to go to the romantic sort of sentimental view of nature that you might get in the landscape paintings of the 19th century.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nathan, for being here for that wonderful lecture. We have a concluding song, so I'll turn it over to Andrea.
On the back of your program, you'll see Bring Healing. This was written by my friend Brett Hessla. He and an alumna of United, Richard Bruxford Culligan, last year wrote this compilation of songs for congregational use. So bridging that theology and environmentalism. Join me. Bring healing to our lives, we pray. Bring healing to our lives, we pray. That we protect this earth. Soften those who only look for gain derived from damaging the planet and the poor. May we see beyond the bottom line in these fair meadows, in these fair woodlands. Bring healing to our lives, we pray. Bring healing to our lives, we pray. That we protect this earth. May we live like we are not alone, knowing how our choices ripple far outside our lives. Other creatures also have a home in these green pastures, by these still waters. Bring healing to our lives, we pray. that we protect this earth. Wake us from dominion's siren spell. Turn us from disrupting all the rhythms that restore. May we stand in awe and be renewed in silent nights, in holy nights. Bring healing to our lives, we pray. Bring healing to our lives, we pray. That we protect this earth.